Usually Asians have smaller joints, smaller waist, nice wide clap. When you take PEDs, there's a degree of masculinity that takes over, and the femininity is important to keep that, because you'll never get that back once that's lost through virilization. Like if systemic inflammation goes up, both men and women are going to suffer equally.
This is Coach Mark Tomanek, and he is the host of the Competitive Edge podcast and owner of Competitive Bodies Gym in Avon Lake, Ohio, where there's literally nobody, but I guess they host the Arnold, so maybe that might be a small reason why there's a lot of bodybuilders there. But Mark is someone that I think is severely underrated in the industry. He has an amazing podcast, and it's one that I've been following for quite a while now. And I think he really just hasn't had the exposure that he needs, but he does have an amazing array of athletes and a large, what you would call it, I guess a coaching team.
Yeah, I've got a few coaching teams at this point. You know, we have Tomanek Train, which is our physique development, our bodybuilding team. And then we have Everybody Coaching, which is more lifestyle, functional health. And then we just built out a sports psychology coaching team, Bulletproof, to actually help take care of mental health and, issues in the industry, since it's so prevalent.
Oh, that's awesome, dude. That's freaking awesome, man. That's something that literally like nobody does, honestly. So I respect that wholeheartedly. That's actually why I was talking to some people like my boy Cameron, and then also Vigorous Steve. I don't know if you know Vigorous Steve, but something that I love about them and also about you too is in all your podcasts, all your YouTube videos, everything that you guys do, all the content that you create, you guys hone in on blood work. You hone in on organ health. You hone in on hormones. You hone in on everything that's really health related and important for someone's longevity when they're like competing in bodybuilding or they're doing anything bodybuilding related. Whereas a lot of other coaches are just like, I'm going to give you this stack. You need to take GH fast in the morning. You need to take this insulin on this day or whatever, and then they don't really explain anything that when it comes to blood work or health, or even like really like demand blood work get done sometimes. So.
Yeah, I think that's been a major gap for many years. And now, like, I'm lucky to come up with a lot of coaches and have a lot of colleagues that are friends that are doing all these things now. And I think the last frontier in bodybuilding to make something so comprehensive that if athletes have any issue, it can be taken care of is the sports psychology realm. So I feel like that's that last frontier that we really needed, and no one was doing it. There were your psychologists and psychiatrists, but none of them actually were bodybuilding. So for them to sort of in a professional to have that experience and to be able to help instead of just tell bodybuilders, well, you should quit because that's hurting you. It's not always the answer. It's sometimes the answer, but not always the answer. So not only taking a functional health approach and mixing with bodybuilding, but also a sports psychology approach and mixing it and allowing these athletes to have access to these tools probably has been one of the coolest things to be able to see and how it's helped athletes stay in the game of bodybuilding.
Wow, that's awesome, man. That's so sick. Okay, so I want to reel this back a little bit. Okay. But yeah, Mark, basically, I love his podcast because not only is he like super transparent about it, but he also provides like a lot of valuable raw information out there for anyone competing or bodybuilders and anyone even interested in just like fitness in general. I think it's all of these things will apply. So appreciate you for all the information you bring out there. Thank you. Also kind of want to reel it back a little bit. Were you originally a social studies teacher?
Yeah. So for 6 years, I taught social studies like economics, government, American history, world history. Yeah, all that. I was that for 6 years in high school.
Damn, dude, what incurred this transition?
I was around bodybuilding growing up. My dad was a bodybuilder, so from about 1990 to 1995, he was a bodybuilder. And he just competed locally. He was a natural competitor, but he did well in whatever he entered. And I grew up watching him doing what he was doing every single day, eating, training, doing everything, all the posing. I watched him and his coach work endlessly for hours, and then I wanted to try my hand at bodybuilding. When I got older, I was most of my way through college. I think the first year I started bodybuilding, I was actually student teaching to finish out my degree, to get my certificate and my licensure to teach in Ohio. Did my first show, and eventually I just had friends. And since I was in the industry for a long time, I learned a lot. When I was wrestling in high school, college, whatever sports like rugby, played that in college. I was always, really focused on my nutrition and like implementing nutritional strategies to be the best performer that I could be, right? Or get to certain body compositions to make weight. So it was always in like bodybuilding esque, puzzle pieces were always in, my life, my entire life growing up. So it was easy for me to transition into bodybuilding and just start putting these pieces together. And the information that I knew, there wasn't a lot of information available at the time, like there is now on Instagram. I just took it all and started applying it and really coaching my friends. And that's where it started. I was actually coaching people in 2013 for competitions prior to me even starting, but
Okay.
yeah, before I even started bodybuilding. But the reality is like, I was just helping my friends. I wasn't doing this professionally. I didn't at the time, bodybuilding coaching wasn't a livable paycheck. So not like it is now. Like now you can actually build a life off of this. You could build entire brands. Like there's so much you could do, right? But that's what really got me into the coaching realm and really made me transition from teaching, where I thought that was going to be my lifestyle path or life path for the rest of my life, 30 years, then you retire. And during 2020, we obviously all went into lockdown. And I had to come home from school and I taught from my computer. But in that time, I'm like, man, I don't leave my house. I could really lock down and just start coaching people and double down and see where I could take this. And so my wife got laid off. We're locked down. I just started building a roster, just started churning out content every day. My gym was still open to me, right? I was able to go every day, create content, do what I wanted to do what I love to do. And eventually it got to a point where, my income was multiplying my teacher salary, which wasn't very much. So it wasn't hard to do, but that's where the transition really kind of set in. And then I retired.
Damn, holy shit, dude. That's a long time. I mean, to be honest,
Yeah.
10 years of experience there, that kind of explains, I think, your vast array of knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, when I started, there was no knowledge. So everything I learned was from forums. You hear like John Meadows talk, Phil Viz. Like I was on my dial-up computer on forums, man. So I learned way back, and then I just took it and started applying with my friends. It worked or it didn't work, and I learned how to navigate through those experiences that maybe were negative or positive and how to get better, which led me to a more functional health approach in bodybuilding and realizing these women were coming to me and wanting to be coached, but they were broken, amenorrhea, adrenal issues, gut issues, and then figure out and learning how to fix all those issues, get them back on stage and win. That became popularized. And now that's where we're at today, where women can, or men in general, have these functional health issues, but they can get back to competing if they're willing to take the time to get healthy.
Mm-hmm. What percentage would you say of your athlete base is women compared to men?
I think now I'm somewhere around like 75% women, 25% men.
Okay.
I think the male side has been growing. It used to be like 90%, and slowly more males have been coming in. Work with a couple classic physique pros, a couple bodybuilders. And then I had quite a bit of success with every male that I put on. They won their class, they won the overall, or taking top 5 at nationals. So the success started cultivating there. Honestly, it's much easier to coach men than it is women.
That's what I was thinking too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I can get a woman on stage who's had, health issues and get them back to winning and winning overalls, well, sure as hell I can do it with men.
That's actually exactly why I wanted to ask you this next question. But what are the biggest differences that you see when you're like coaching men versus women?
Yeah. So, I think that there's so many different facets I can go here. So with men specifically, you can push them physically to a degree that you could never push a woman, because their hormonal, resiliency is far different. Whereas women, they have negative feedback loops that literally protect them. So, cortisol is going to enact progesterone steal. They're going to be more susceptible to adrenal dysfunction, insufficiency. They've also had a multitude of factors, epigenetic factors, and even you consider birth control, that have literally altered their genetic sequence to some degree, or genetic switch, I should say. And then they end up actually experiencing a greater degree of health issues. And on top of that, like when you go to prep them, you can't just push them and do a ton of cardio and pull food. It's not going to work all the time. With maybe a select few, it might. But eventually you're going to run into some type of hormonal dysfunction where progesterone and estradiol are going to plummet. And then they're not going to have the ability to, burn fat at the same rate. Like people think crushing estrogen is a good thing for women,
Oh,
when in fact that's the opposite of what we want to do. So you have a lot of coaches using like Arimidex or Nolvadex or even letrozole in women,
like what, to get them
and
leaner or something?
yeah, right. Things are going to get them leaner. I'm like, you're actually blunting fat loss potential. So, there's a time and a place, of course, but even with PED application, it's entirely different. Men can sustain way more, stress, physical stress, emotional stress, mental stress, like, and their bodies won't degrade as fast. Whereas women, it's just a little different. It's a little bit more tedious. You have to be more detail oriented. You have to consider more. You also have to consider all the different societal, factors that play on them mentally and emotionally on a consistent basis, because it's not the same for men. Men don't have it, as difficult as women in that regard. How they're constantly getting this external judgment and external validation from people, and it's impacting the way that they see themselves, the way that they treat themselves. And all of that plays a massive role on how successful they are in bodybuilding. And then you get into the masculine and femininity of women in bodybuilding, and you get into a whole nother realm of, when you take PEDs, there's a degree of masculinity that takes over, and the femininity is important to keep that, because you'll never get that back once that's lost through virilization. I just think women have so many different uphill battles that men don't have to deal with. Whereas we're like, okay, we'll take PEDs. We'll run into functional health issues here and there, but it's much easier to quit fat, much easier to fix. When we come off of cycle, we go on TRT, we don't have to get back estradiol, progesterone production. Like, there's just so many things we don't have to do that they do.
Of course, this is different. This is different depending on if you're, say in your bikini or wellness or figure or whatever. But how do you avoid virilization?
That's a tough topic, because I think the only way to avoid it completely is don't take PEDs, and we're in a sport where PEDs are absolutely necessary in most of these divisions.
Mm-hmm.
There are some that are just absolute genetic freaks, and bless them, that they're lucky. They don't have to take, maybe the degree of PEDs or any PEDs at all and be successful. However, for those that have to take them to be successful because they want to win, it's taking less in terms of dosage for less amount of time. So it's just shortening duration and lessening the dosage. Poison's really in those two components right there.
That makes a lot of sense. It's always a hard guessing game, but I mean, I feel like this is true with any drugs. You continuously increase your dosage of Adderall, and you start getting the bad side effects without any of the benefits that you draw from it. And I think the same can be said with PEDs, but everybody has to just figure out what their own dosage is.
Yeah, there's some women, I put them on primo for a growth phase, which I would most commonly use for growth phases for women's divisions. And I believe it to be on the quote unquote safer side, if we want to look at it from that perspective. Some women, you put them on 30 milligrams a week, they experience nothing. Not even their cycle changes. They don't have cycle fluctuations. And then you put someone else on 30 milligrams and they bleed the whole time, or they lose their cycle entirely, or they experience their voice getting a little bit raspy, or they experience some clitoral swelling. So these are all things that are potentially possible, but they're so individually based on what dosage, how long, what drugs are we going to expose them to? And then how do they respond to that given dosage? Do they grow on that given dosage? Do they need more? It's so individual.
How would you say, do you see any differences between, say, primo and anavar?
I think we look at anavar as like a women's like safe drug, but the reality is it's still a DHT derivative, same class. However, you can't run it for as long because you're taxing liver and kidneys with anavar, whereas primo you're not. So it bypasses two organ systems that are going to potentially take abuse from a drug that has a toxic load, which all drugs have a toxic load. And our objective should be to try to keep toxicity as low as possible with any compound that we use. Anavar, for me, in my programming, is more of a fullness component. If I notice a woman needs a little bit of fullness, last few weeks of contest prep, I'll add it in a very low dosage. 5 milligrams, maybe 10 milligrams max. I don't think I've went over 10 milligrams of anavar in my career. Again, 5 to 10 milligrams works perfectly. However, you can't run it more than 8 weeks. You don't want to, you can, but you shouldn't, right? Because that toxicity factor. Not only that, like, how much muscle are you really going to build in 8 weeks? So we start looking at like we want the biggest bang for our buck. We can't run this forever. Anavar, toxicity, organs are taking a hit like liver. And so it's just not a drug that I choose willingly for a growth phase. Whereas Primo, again, DHT derivative, again, talk a little more androgenic, obviously, but at the same time, it's not taxing liver, not taxing kidneys, but virilization potential is there for both. You'll still experience the voice deepening if you run it for too long, too much. You'll still experience potentially acne, body hair growth, clitoral swelling. All those things are definitely possible with both.
So, hormonal issues, what are some hormonal issues that get more in depth that you see between natural men versus women when competing in body?
Natural men and women.
Yeah.
Let's see. I think for men, you're going to experience low T no matter what, because as you put more stress on the body, right, you're going to experience testosterone downregulation. So if you take a male in the beginning of prep, measure their serum levels of total testosterone and free test, it'll be right in range, right? Wherever their normal is. At the end of prep, it's going to be significantly lower because we're dealing with, a high cortisol production, and that's going to tax, or it's going to actually impact that feedback loop. Testosterone is not going to be as high. Their body's too stressed. And so I think that's the major, like cortisol and testosterone are major components of what males deal with from a hormonal perspective. Obviously there's, with testosterone being inhibited, there's a neurological component like dopamine levels, dropping. But for women, it's much more complex because even if they're enhanced or they're natural, they're still going to experience, in a contest prep, they're still going to experience downregulation of progesterone and estradiol. So they're going to experience estrogen dominance, which it comes in many different forms, whether we're talking about low estrogen, low progesterone, high estrogen, high or low progesterone, or even normal estrogen, low progesterone. Really, it's that progesterone estradiol ratio that's really important for that individual. So what we're looking at there is obviously amenorrhea potential, right? Where they're not going to have a bleed on a consistent basis. Maybe it's not predictable. Maybe they miss cycles, multiple cycles, lose their cycle altogether, light spotting, right? Tons of different variations. We also have adrenal issues, which are very common with women, right? So you have the adrenal glands, which do produce cortisol, but sometimes they experience dysfunction when they produce abundant amount of cortisol, or insufficiency where they're underproducing cortisol. Insufficiency is worse than dysfunction. But anytime you have dysfunction or insufficiency in those cases, you're dealing with also low sex hormones. So that's where it gets a little tricky. Like these systems are all intertwined, and that's not even touching on, gut related issues like gut dysbiosis, which impacts feedback loops and metabolic hormones as well. But just from a hormonal or a sex hormone perspective, anytime you prep as a woman, you're going to experience some downregulation of production of those two hormones, unless you already have hormonal birth control in, which suppresses all that anyways. So you don't produce any endogenously.
Okay. What were the two hormones that you said?
Progesterone and estradiol.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yep.
So what about if these athletes aren't natural, if they're enhanced, what kind of hormonal issues do you normally run into with men versus women?
So men, like you're going to be supplementing TRT, right? Or testosterone. So realistically, like, once you start testosterone, probably be on TRT forever. Like, once you're going to downregulate that axis, that testes axis, or HPT axis, like, you might as well stay on TRT. So you're really going to mostly look at more so like organ issues with men, kidneys taking a toll, liver taking a toll, cardiovascular tissue. Then you get into maybe, hypertension mixed with cholesterol issues like hyperlipidemia. So you're looking at cardiovascular diseases and events and the potential of those. Women, on the other hand, it's again more complex. If they're enhanced and they're not on birth control, like again, you're still applying an androgen and excess. So you're gonna have hormonal dysfunction. So again, estrogen, progesterone, all down regulating throughout the process. If they're on hormonal birth control, that's already done because they're already implementing a steroid, being hormonal birth control. So it's already shutting down that axis, their HPO axis. So I think the important factor here, and to understand that these issues are going to happen no matter what, whether you prep naturally or enhanced. I do find that prepping with enhancements And this doesn't just mean anabolics, but prepping with enhancements is inherently safer because the prep is less lengthy and the severity of the deficit and the amount of cardio they have to do is less. So we're putting less total systemic stress on these physiologies in these women. Therefore, they're able to recover quicker.
That's interesting.
It's pretty much the opposite of what we hear, right?
Yeah, no, very, very much so. In fact, something that I like to stress to people, something like I like to stress in general, especially on this podcast, of course, is that a lot of people out there just seem to think that if you take steroids, then you don't have to work as hard as a natural. And I really do hate that, because just literally, it's like, say someone just steps on your podcast and listens to it. There is so much complexity and so many things that we have to monitor, especially if we're on, enhancements and PEDs, not just for the sake, purely for the sake of our well-being and our health. And what's more important than our health, than our life, know?
Something you can't get back.
Right. I mean, I guess this value changers is like, say that you're someone that's not really in the best kind of mindset. And so you don't really care about like your life so much. You really only just care about like becoming someone or becoming something or getting jacked or something. And that's all that fucking matters to you. And you would literally die for it. Then I can understand where some people will say, oh, like you can eat whatever the fuck you want when you're on PEDs, or you can just slack off when you're on PEDs. Like, I guess so. But like in the end, I mean, you're not going to be getting the optimal outcome. Plus, I really do believe that everybody has to overcompensate and, work even harder, eat even cleaner when you're running anything.
Yeah. I mean, when you're running PEDs, it just allows you to work harder for longer. That's literally all it does. You just recover faster. That doesn't negate all the work that has to be done. And a lot of times it can make the process a lot smoother and a lot more safe, especially when we're talking about contest prep in general. We're going to hold on to more muscle mass. You're going to be able to push and recover faster. That means you don't have to put as much pressure on your physiology and acquire so much inflammation, because that inflammation is the real killer to health. Like if systemic inflammation goes up, both men and women are going to suffer equally. So I think a lot of times we should be always thinking about how can we do the work we need to get where we want to be, but do it smarter and safer.
Well, I mean, PEDs increase inflammation, right?
They increase toxicity, which can increase inflammation. Yeah. So, drugs aren't inherently inflammatory. A lot of times the practices and lifestyles that we have and behaviors that we have in life are pro-inflammatory. You throw toxicity on top of that, now you're running into a big issue. So this is why it's important to monitor your dosage, make them like less toxic as possible. So the least amount of drugs, minimum effective dosing for the shortest amount of time.
Gotcha. Okay. Definitely agree with that. So going back to stress, you said you seem to see more, was it like adrenal fatigue or with females than males?
So I think they both definitely experience it. I noticed that the adrenal axis is more easily affected in women than it is men, but men do definitely experience it, because I've seen so many Dutch panels where, men are suffering from adrenal insufficiency, where they're underproducing cortisol. So to explain it like this, instead of, it's not necessarily adrenal fatigue, but more so adrenal insufficiency or dysfunction. So, and there's two different categories here. So if I was to give you a visual, your cortisol pattern should look like at midnight, it should be at its lowest point. At about 6 a.m., it'll hit a peak, and that's your waking response. That's your natural waking response. So cortisol peaks about 6 a.m. And then throughout the day, that cortisol is going to decrease over time.
Would you say 6 a.m. is true with everybody?
It's going to vary based on your circadian rhythm pattern, like based on your sleep-wake cycles. But just to give you a reference point, like that spike could happen at 8 a.m. if you're used to waking up at 8 a.m.
Right. It's normally like a couple hours before, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, there's some variance here in timing, but the general trend should look like, peak in the morning, decrease throughout the day, lowest point, somewhere around midnight, right? When you're supposed to be sleeping. However, this pattern is disrupted in individuals that don't sleep, maybe regular hours or predictable hours. Maybe they actually work nights. People that are overly stressed throughout the day. They have an excess in cortisol production. So if you look at a Dutch test, you'll see like the high range of cortisol and its pattern throughout the day, and then you'll see a low range. Well, dysfunction is in the high range, whereas insufficiency is in the low range. But both men and women experience this equally to some degree, or can experience it equally. However, the probability of women experiencing it easier is in favor of women. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does.
Okay. Without showing like an actual visual of the cortisol pattern, people are probably like, what the hell?
Right. So for females, this is just a question kind of that came up in my mind while you were speaking over here. But since obviously females, we don't have a TRT for them. So what normally would say a PCT look like post competition?
So, in the case of women that are absent of hormonal birth control, our objective should be immediately to one, get testosterone levels back up to normal if they are suppressed, and B, get progesterone and estrogen production back online or increase from where it's at. Because if you insert, whether you're in a prep or you're just in an off season and you insert PEDs, the rate of production is decreasing no matter what. So a PCT will look like, A, how can we get hormonal production back online? So supplementation. So whether we're thinking about like chasteberry or like a Women's Health by Revive or Morphodite by Morphogen, like those are supplements that will help aid in hormonal production. But also we need to look at behaviors. So one, making sure we're sleeping, 7-8 hours a night, making sure that circadian rhythm pattern, it's predictable, it's consistent. And then also we probably need to decrease training volume and intensity to some degree. Not only that, their lives, all of our lives are pretty stressful to some degree, but we need to be able to lower that and lessen the amount of stress and stimulus we're putting on the body. Excuse me. If we can lower caffeine levels too and stimulant levels, that would be wonderful as well. Essentially, what I'm trying to do in any PCT format is lower toxicity, get the drugs out, bring on hormonal production back online or up to a place where we find it to be optimal for that woman, and then lower stimulus across the board. So if we could do that, there'll be healthy quickly. So and again, I don't really have a timeline either. Like some women, their PCT, they can be back to optimal within, 6 to 8 weeks. Some of them you bring down the drugs or you bring in the drugs and their hormones don't even change. Like there's no down regulation. I've seen that too. And that's very rare, but it does happen.
Wow.
So yeah, that kind of sums up what we should be doing, PCT.
Gotcha. So for males, we have, for example, HCG and clomiphene. Do females have any, PCT, HRT medications or something? I mean, anything similar of the sort?
So for women, ultimately we do have HRT and TRT available, right? For women, if you go through a hormone clinic, you have TRT, you could, again, some women do need it. And depending on age, if they've already went through menopause, TRT, HRT is going to be probably their best bet and the safest thing that they could do and the healthiest thing that they could do. But, that is really functional way of bringing hormones back online. Like I talked about in the previous topic, the previous question, that's probably the most optimal. If women are going to continue to compete and they want to make a living out of it, they want to be professionals, they are professionals and they do this year round, HRT and TRT, where we're supplementing testosterone through injections, we're supplementing estrogen and progesterone and getting them to optimal levels and wherever that physician deems it appropriate for them or optimal for them, then they should probably go that route. Men, on the other hand, it's just bring them down to TRT. And I wouldn't even suggest HCG unless you want fertility increase. It's like, if you want fertility, sure. If you're not worried about fertility, it can stay out, and with the men that I coach, unless they want to have kids, I don't bring them off of TRT. So I won't pull out drugs entirely because that's a whole nother topic. Like low T has its own subset of issues. So instead I just bring them down to a TRT dosage anywhere from 125 to maybe 175 milligrams a week of testosterone and just keep them there. Then run labs, make sure everything's in good standing.
I think that's a very controversial topic in the industry right now. There's people who believe that you should still come off of TRT. I think this is most common in pretty big bodybuilders. And then, you have other people a little bit more science-based that claim why is there ever a point in coming off of TRT? Do you really want to go through that depression and through the entire cycle of just absolute dog shit? because I definitely
Yeah,
wouldn't want to.
right. It is a period where you just feel like shit. And like you're right, depression, far more probable. And if you pull out testosterone, which is an aromatizing compound, meaning if you increase testosterone, you're increasing estrogen, no matter what, right? Because the aromatization rate. If you bring out testosterone, you drop it all the way down. Now your estrogen is disproportionate to your testosterone level. And so you run into a whole nother subset of issues there as well. So it is, I know it's heavily debated, but in practice, in like a clinical setting, the probably the smartest thing you could do is take TRT, because you'll never get your testosterone levels back to an optimal place where they once were before you started using anabolics.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think even with HCG and clomiphene, like you can boost it to maybe a better level temporarily, but once you're off of that cycle, it'll go back down a little bit. So
Yep.
in the end,
Yeah.
you
And
inject anything, it's going to affect it.
oh yeah, for sure. I mean, you're definitely, once you touch drugs, you are changing, right, the baseline of what normal is for you.
I agree. Gets me thinking. I don't know if you've ever heard, but of like androgen response and like genetic predisposition to like muscle hypertrophy between like different ethnicities.
Yeah, I don't have much like literature in that area, but I have a mentor who that I he so his name's Eric, and he actually is Instagram handle Rockin' Pro, and he's trained pros like pro bodybuilders, and he's been training for shit longer than I've been alive, probably. So, he has a different way that he trains like different ethnicities, and he's never like really broke it down to me because I've never really asked, because I don't invest too much into that. Just like we just got to do what's best for that individual. I can't say like in my experience, I can't say, hey, look, this ethnicity requires this and this, these variables. It's like it's never been like that. It's always just been very individual.
Mm-hmm. I feel that too. There was just one thing I recall that was really interesting to me that I heard Leo in Longevity say. I don't know if you know of him.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. He like passed away a couple of months ago, but he do a lot of podcasts with more plates and bigger Steve. And he was mentioning that, anecdotally, based off of everything they've seen, I think this is kind of obvious, but black people tend to, be able to build the most muscle naturally. But then when you also put them on androgens, they also tend to have the best androgen response. And the people that he sees the worst, both, natural muscle hypertrophy and androgen response, ends up being Asians. Which,
Really?
yeah, according to him at least.
That's crazy because like when I look at genetic structures, like usually Asians have smaller joints, smaller waist, nice wide clap. Like you see these beautiful physiques put together. Like think about like men's physique and think about classic physique. Even some of the bigger bodybuilders you're seeing now that are stepping on stage, like dude, the physiques are beautifully built. So that surprises me.
Well, I think structure is different, right, than just pure muscle hypertrophy
True.
in response to androgens. I think what he just means is just what is your capacity of building muscle, how quickly, how well do you respond to the androgens, and black people just seem to tend to respond the best. And then Asians, like I think most Asians have great structure. They tend to have smaller
Yeah.
waists, some great proportions. A lot of East Asians have some crazy legs already, but
Yep.
then I guess just building muscle in general, which kind of makes sense because you look at Asian culture as a whole naturally, and we're not really the most jacked ethnicity. We're not really the most jacked group of people.
Right.
And I guess
Right.
androgen response is
Yeah.
the same, which is really interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, you look at if you go on the Olympia stage, right? Take the top 10, and look at it from there. I always like to use the Olympia as like my standard, even though it's the best athletes in the world. It's a good judgment of like what people are capable of, right? And how we should even critique our physiques or base our physiques on, because that's the standard.
I agree. I mean, I would assume that everyone on Olympia is literally putting everything in everything. So
Using all the tools.
right. By the way, total random question, man. But what's the Megatron from your Instagram handle?
So this was something that came up in college, actually. And it was just from a group of my friends that, again, I was always lifting, always training heavy, right? And that's what I've always loved training. It was something that I just love going all out, going nuts with, even how I train today. And I'm not a bodybuilder today, but I still train with the same level of intensity that I did through, coming up when I was in high school to now. It's only increased. So I think just the training intensity is kind of where that derived from, and like my intensity in general, just as a person. I think that was mainly where that derived from, that nickname.
That's dope.
Yeah.
I love that, bro. I actually haven't watched. I haven't gone to the movie theaters in like probably like I think it's been like a year and a half or something, and I haven't watched a movie in like I swear like half a year. And I'm going to see the screening for the Transformers tonight.
Oh, that's dope. I don't think I've seen the last one that came out, but this one looks really, really cool. It got it, and as critics always do, they kind of blasted this one, which is kind of disappointing, but it'll probably be great anyways.
Do they really? Oh,
yeah,
shit.
they always do though. Like every movie that comes out, every Marvel movie that comes out, they just like destroy it. And I'm like, you know what? Fuck you guys. Like,
damn. Whatever. I'm just gonna take this opportunity as a little cheat meal, little butterfree popcorn or something.
There you go, man. Hell yeah.
All right. So talking about training, what are your beliefs around training? How do you believe training should look like, rep sets, tempo, etc., if say you're focusing purely on hypertrophy?
Sure. I mean, the name of the game is stimulus load, right? How much stimulus does it take to get this physique to grow? Now, there's so many ways to get to a stimulus level. So I have people that like training high volume, some that like low volume. I have people that like doing, drop sets. They prefer back down sets. They prefer rest pause sets, right? I have so many people that prefer even supersetting, which not a huge fan of. But my objective going into a set or of a given exercise, and we'll just call it a top set or a working set, whatever people want to name it, right? That final set in your exercise. Our objective is to push the stimulus level as high as we possibly can to exceed a previous stimulus level that was achieved. So the body has new stimulus or a new stimulus level that it now needs to adapt to. Now, in order to hit that stimulus level, you could do it in many different ways. For me and myself, I'm just a one top set guy. That's it. There's some people that respond better to two top sets. For me, I'm like, if I give it all, my all, 100%, there's no way I can go back and do a second set and exceed that previous level. Mm-hmm. I'm giving my all. So for me, it's like, get it done in the least amount of sets as possible with the most amount of given intensity that you could possibly muster. So but with my athletes, it just comes in so many different ways, shapes, or forms. I have never been stuck to, it has to be this way. I have so many different people, so many different requirements. I mean, I coach anywhere from type 1 diabetics to pros. So it's like, I have to be able to navigate training and what's available to these athletes, or their level of experience in the gym, their ability to move through certain ranges, change exercise selection based on biomechanics. I have to be able to change this willingly and freely. So I don't really have like this belief. It's just this simple belief or the simple fact, physiological fact, that we need to exceed previous stimulus levels. How we do it, it's up for interpretation. We'll find what's best for that person. In an ideal situation or scenario, like one top set, two failure should be plenty, as long as that person understands what failure is, understands what intense training is. Because if you put two people in a room, you say, hey, train to failure, it's going to look immensely different. There's going to be such a disparity between the two. It's not going to look the same. Their idea of what is perceived failure and what is actually mechanical failure, it can be so different.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I know there's two different types of failures, right? There's a like absolute failure, and then I don't remember what the other one is. I don't know if it's mechanical failure or what.
But so absolute failure would be mechanical failure, and then your perceived failure, where you're like in your mind's like, yo, you got to stop. This is too much. That's your perceived failure, because you're perceiving it as failure, but your body could definitely do more.
I was thinking about two different types of failure, where one is you're holding form the entire time, and then
okay.
Right. And then the second failure is like where you start breaking a little bit of form in order to just mechanically get that up. I remember that I talked about, but I don't quite remember what the names of those are. So
I don't even know the names either. But honestly, like so if we look at the exercises or exercise by exercise, It's like, should you break form and tempo, right? And some exercises, why not, right? It's safe. For example, hack squat, pendulum squat, leg extension, hamstring curl, all things you could break form on, and your risk of injury or potential injury definitely decreased. Whereas barbell squats, yep, probably don't want to do that. The risk potential is too high.
Right.
Deadlifts probably don't want to do that. So, we have to, what I like to do is I like to add specific tempos to my exercises, and then a rate or level of intensity next to that tempo. And so it gives the athlete some reference points to understand that, hey, this exercise where I go nuts on. This is an exercise where I kind of pull back and I'm more adherent to the tempo to be more careful.
Gotcha.
So when I program something, it includes all those details. That way they're fully informed about how we want to play this exercise.
I think that's what's so freaking fun about bodybuilding and training for hypertrophy is, according to Andy Galpin, if you've ever listened to any of his stuff, when it comes down to focusing purely on hypertrophy, not power, not strength, whatever, just hypertrophy, there is such a wide a range of different types of training that you can do. And that's where it comes down to, like, it's almost like an art form. Like, what kind of way do you want to paint your own body? And everybody has their own different kind of ways. But at least according to Andy Galpin, it just seems that, it really all seems to come down to a form of time under tension and progressive overload. As long as you're under that tension for a distinct amount of like time, and then you're always, progressing on your stimulus, you're going to be growing. Whereas like, for example, for like, if you're training for power, you got to watch your volume, and then you got to make sure that you're, just upping the weight every single time. You're keeping it to like three rep sets, for example. It's a lot more strict, I think.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I like about training and like coaching so many different people. Whether they're lifestyle or they're, again, pros, it really doesn't matter. Like, I'm still having fun with training with them because like it's so different. It is such an art form, at its core. That I like getting creative. I like having to be creative with people. I think the biggest thing that we forget about and neglect sometimes when we're coaching people is this fun for them? Because if it's not fun, like, they're not going to stick with it. They're not going to stick with you, right? So to some degree, we want, obviously, the principle of overload. We want tempo to be involved. We want to push people's both perception of failure and their actual like mechanical failure capabilities, their pain threshold. We want to push all these things that are truly unique to each person. But I think the core of it comes down to, do you love it? Are you having fun? Because if you're not having fun, like, it's just, I will say this, people progress way faster when they're having fun. Truly. The people that don't like it don't progress as fast.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, it's simple, like human nature. We invest way more into things we love.
I'm sure the people that aren't having as much fun are definitely going to be more stressed too.
Yep. And it is funny how much, like, when you get someone to realize how much they're actually stressed and like what is actually stimulus that's inhibiting their progressions or their health, when you get them to finally realize it, it's like their mind explodes. Like, what? Like, all these things are stress and stimulus. I'm like, well, yeah, they are. And like, you need to find a way to eliminate or reduce, this stimulus level.
So stress, actually, you were talking about before how, like, you tend to see people that like are, say, like holding a lot of water weight or seem to be a little bit bloated or round or anything, and this tends to be more often than not likely because of aldosterone, maybe wreaking havoc. Mm-hmm. So, Can you explain a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so a lot of times, when you look at kidney function or renal function, right, in the RAS system, what you're looking at is the adrenals. Once again, when under stress, right, you have a couple of adrenal hormones, epinephrine, right, and cortisol. Epinephrine being adrenaline. So when you get stressed and cortisol goes up, cortisol production goes up, fight or flight is now your state of being, and you're into a sympathetically driven state. Where, again, if you look at the history of humanity and our development, right, fight or flight was designed for a reason, so we could run from the saber-toothed tiger that was trying to kill us, or fight, when the time came, we had to, kind of fight or for dominance or whatever it was. But really, all we're looking at is, if cortisol goes up, if epinephrine goes up, we know blood pressure is also going to go up. So if blood pressure goes up, now we're impacting hypertension, it's impacting renal function. and it will change sodium potassium balance, not only in kidney values, but also our blood levels, our blood serum levels. And so, yeah, you have like during like a peaking situation, when someone's like really stressed, they'll start retaining a ton of water. And usually it has a specific look. Like you could tell someone's stressed, or you could tell when someone has been using diuretics and not using them properly. They ultimately will have like a very watery look and flat look to them. And
Mm,
so if you could manage, and this is where it becomes really important in peaking, is like managing stress levels, reducing cortisol, getting an athlete to relax, sleep a decent amount, a good amount, even when excitement's high, you're going to end up with a much better physique every single time. And that
mm.
aldosterone won't go and literally just ransack your peak, because I've seen aldosterone destroy physiques in a matter of a couple hours.
Wow, crazy. Where do you see aldosterone increasing? Like, what are people normally doing?
So I think the major one is with fluid intake. So no matter what you do, if you decrease fluids, you're potentiating the possibility of aldosterone increasing. Now you cut water, you probably have like 12 hours. I'm saying if you cut water entirely, you probably have about 12 hours until aldosterone is going to start impacting visually what's going on with your physique. Sometimes less time with people, sometimes a little bit more time. It depends on the individual. So aldosterone is definitely impacted by fluid intake. So it's important when you're peaking athletes to make sure we are getting in some degree of fluids based on what they need. You want to monitor even like urine color to check on people's hydration levels, and then their look. So I don't ever pull out like water entirely. They'll get like a couple sips here and there. You know, if we're on the lower end of the spectrum of water intake, other people like Francesca, I just peaked. She had 70 ounces on show day. So there's such a wide variety of like what you could do with water and in the individual. If you use diuretics, you know, they can and will impact fluid balance and therefore aldosterone production. If you don't sleep, it will affect aldosterone. If you stress and you have like you have a cortisol response or an epinephrine response, it definitely will like waterlog people and impact aldosterone as well. So those are the main ones I see be impacted during like a peak scenario.
Okay, cool. This is a question that my audience is interested in. And I know that this can kind of apply to, say, like if you're doing a peak week, but hypothetically, say that John has a beach date that he'd like to look good for in a week. How would you say he can look his leanest and his best?
Diet 6 months before. No, I mean, if we're just trying to get, there's not much you can do in a week. And this is what I try to tell people. It's like, even when people go on vacation, I'm like, you need to give me a significant amount of time to actually pull down body fat. Because what really happens when we just cut calories for a small diet or to look good for a wedding or a beach day, like, well, we just immediately cut calories. What actually ends up happening, we just lose muscle fullness. And so we actually end up looking a little bit worse. And there's people that are just try to throw like diuretics in. I'm like, then you're just dehydrating yourself. And then if you throw alcohol on top of that, your
Oh
kidneys are
shit,
taking a
dude.
beating. So
Flap
it
a
can be
fat
a
stage.
real, what's that?
Fat stage, bro. Fuck.
Right, right. You skinny fat stage. That's what I tell my athletes. I'm like, hey, look, for a few weeks, skinny fat stage. Man, it's gonna happen. You're gonna look like shit. You're gonna feel like you look like shit. It's all right. We'll get past it. We'll get really lean. You'll look great. So I just tell people like it's not even worth trying to crash, a system or multiple systems or inhibit multiple systems to look good for a day. It's something that if we want to look actually good, we actually want to change like our body fat set point. This is something we should be working on all the time. Not that you can diet all year round, but this is truly what we should be changing our lifestyle, our behaviors and habits now, so that we don't have to worry when the time comes to go to the beach that if we look good or not. We always
Yeah.
look good.
I agree with this. I actually was terrified for the last 3 years because, the last 3 years I was keeping myself as shredded as possible for Instagram. So now that I decided to completely change my brand and like compete again, try to get on the Olympia stage and everything, I was like worried about like, holy shit, like I've been not eating for 3 years. I haven't gained any muscle. What's going to happen now that I'm finally eating food? I've been like suppressing my thyroid, and luckily I was on TRT, so I didn't have any, hormonal issues. But prior to me being on TRT, man, my testosterone was crashed. So
Yeah.
I'm just like, shit, what's going to happen? And what I realized is I started off I started off my entire journey like around 12 years old as a fat kid. So I've always been more endomorphic. But now I think because of the last 3 years of being essentially in a small deficit at all times, just to be like,
Mhm.
striated, now that I'm eating food, I'm still maintaining my abs, which is
Yep.
crazy to me. Like my body fat set point, like even though I did it for 3 years, has drastically changed, which is really cool
Yeah,
to see.
there's so many different ways to effectively change your body fat set point, but one of those is stay in a deficit for a long time. Now, like you kind of saw, like the bill does come due with health after. But another way to really impact your body fat set point is add muscle tissue. Since it's metabolically active tissue, you burn more calories at a resting rate. So just laying in bed, being muscular, you burn significantly more calories than someone that doesn't have that amount of muscle tissue, which is kind of unique. So, if you want to change your body fat set point long term, the smartest thing we could do, and I think the safest thing, is we could add a ton of muscle tissue. And then you're able to actually sustain a lower body fat more easily or more readily, instead of having to. I think a lot of people just try to like diet, but they don't have the muscle to support like a leaner looking, harder physique because the muscle's not there. So you people end up with a bunch of people that are just like skinny fat. Whereas if you add the muscle tissue beforehand, you could easily diet and maintain that body fat, that lower body fat set point. It's an easier way to diet every time.
Okay, so going back to John, who has his beach date weekend or whatever, say that he did get his leanest, like he cut down for 6 months, and now he's kind of like at his leanest physique, and he feels great. Now he wants to look his best for the beach, like whatever he can within the week, kind of like a peak week for a show. What would you suggest that he does?
So if he's got to the point where he's actually very lean and very insulin sensitive and the body's not overly stressed. So, cortisol isn't impacting us. We're sleeping, right? Because I think sleep is probably the most effective fat loss potentiator that we have as humans. If all those things are in order, and he's pretty well depleted, very insulin sensitive, I would probably go through a period of 3 to 4 days of a moderate front load with carbohydrates. As we get closer, within maybe a day before, and we want to look really good, I would then escalate or titrate water down just slightly. I think water has the potential to make a physique look really fucking good. And I think a lot of people underestimate that. It's not that I never pull water out of any of my athletes because it definitely happens, right? But I think just even titrating that water down, after a period of a little bit of loading or a light loading, a front load, you can end up with a really solid just beach physique. Just doing that. So I think that's kind of the safest way to play it, without getting into like specifics of like, here's how many macros, here's how many carbs, all of that.
Okay, nice. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So for a perfect peak week for your athletes, what do you believe in with carbohydrates, water, electrolytes, maybe even supplements? Should or should they not be manipulated, and how so?
So with peak week, there's no rules. And I've peaked people in the most odd way. And I've also done it in the most lackadaisical way. There's been times I've sent athletes on stage changing absolutely nothing. Nothing. Water stayed the same. Food stayed the same. In fact, Rania, who I coached for nationals this past nationals, I had the same food intake with no cardio. I did not change her water at all for 2.5 weeks. Previous to nationals, she took fifth. And she's never placed at a national stage before. So she looked her best she's ever looked by doing nothing different than what she's doing. However, in some cases, my objective in peak week is just fatigue management. So that's my first objective. How can I get cardio down, get them to sleep more, decrease total step count or movement count to decrease total inflammation? So the lines are going to be really crisp. Our body's not overly stressed or overly taxed, and aldosterone is not going to impact feedback loops or the look. As far as like supplementation, at that point, we want to keep stimulants pretty low. I still usually keep in like Clen, which I know a lot of people drop during peak week, but if you drop Clen, you drop basal metabolic rate. So you need to be careful about how much you change that. If you're using something like T3, that needs to stay in. You could drop it a little bit. You could play around with it a little bit, but every time you change the T3 levels, right, you're changing basal metabolic rate. So if you change basal metabolic rate and food intake, now you're turning multiple dials, which leads to some unpredictability. So I want to keep as many things as constant as possible, but decrease fatigue management. I usually with loading food, whether I'm going with fats or I'm going with carbs, because some people do look better with fat loads than they do carb loads for whatever reason. You add carbs, lines blur. I have a couple athletes like that. Most people, though, accept carbs pretty easily. You do like a 4 or 5 day front load. Some do a 7 day front load. I rarely do back loading, like Friday scenario where you just cram as much food as you can, to fill glycogen stores. But some people do need to make weight. So, and that kind of depends on when, weigh-ins are. If weigh-ins are the day before, what I probably try to do is get a food intake amount or carbohydrate intake amount that I'm able to maintain the weight that they're supposed to weigh in at. So I'll find that weight and then just hold the food exactly where I need to maintain that weight. And then once we're done, then you can start pushing food a little bit more. But there's only so many carbohydrates you can push or partition, a short amount of time. So, maybe in some of these cases, use insulin, which you can use a rapid analog to do that. You just got to watch for potassium balance. It can kind of throw off and skew the look a little bit. So there's so many variables. Sometimes when people need to load a lot, you pull down protein, increase your carbohydrates. Maybe you bring in a fat like coconut oil. That's easily digestible so you can move food quicker. You know, it really, really is person dependent. So I'm sorry that's kind of scattered, but it's just there's so many different ways to do it. It's literally, and I tell people this that I peak. I'm like, you're gonna be checking in after each meal, like an hour after each meal. I want to see what you look like between each meal because I gotta find an exact look that I want, and I also want to match it to a weight because then I can use that weight as a reference point how close we are in terms of fullness, and the look that we're after. Water, on the other hand, like this is something that can change. And again, I kept water consistent. I've done a gallon of water on show day, and then I've done like probably as little as 12 ounces. I'm just putting a little bit of water with food for digestion purposes. So it can range anywhere between there. It's like, again, when I add water in, do you look better? Okay, we'll stick with some water. If I add water, do you look spilled? Okay, then we'll pull back on the water the next meal and we'll just keep food in. So it's always monitoring the look as you're kind of turning all those individual dials to find the look that you want. And it's a tedious process. Like I told Francesca this weekend, I was like, I'm sorry, I'm probably annoying you. She was, no, this is great. Like I'm happy. Like you're actually paying attention. And I was not in New Jersey with her. So I wasn't there. I'll be there for Universe with her in person, but we ended up getting a perfect look for finals. We were a little flat for prejudging based on Steve said we were not flat. I think we were flat. I guess I got to defer to Steve though, because he is Steve Weinberger, right? So, but I wanted a little bit of a fuller look, which we achieved at finals. So it's just constant assessment and adjustment of the person and what they need. And a lot of times I'm pulling information, based on previous experiences with them, like a refeed or a diet break, like how do they respond to those food levels? And I'm pulling information from there to make decisions now.
Gotcha. So why a 3 to 4 day front load rather than say like an extended back load?
A lot of times it just comes down to partitioning. There's also a significant advantage with front loading because in the beginning of your peak week, all right, before you start loading, thyroid is going to be at its lowest productivity level the entire prep. Whereas if I bump food up a little bit, like you do refeeds with people and they drop weight, well, same concept, right? Thyroid activity improves significantly, you start adding food. And that almost got away from us with Francesca's peak because we started adding food, weight drops. Add food, weight drops. I'm like, oh shit, now we might be too lean now, because she starts tightening up as the week's going on, as I'm feeding her more, she's tightening up. So there's an advantage of being able to, essentially, if you're not 100% on, you could get 100% lean to where you need to by increasing and titrating food and front loading. In other cases, I just do it because I don't want to. I think it's more of a risk to backload because then I don't have a lot of time to monitor the look, to find the look that I want, and the ability to partition the nutrients. If someone I'm peaking let's say classic physique pro who's 220 pounds, the risk of them not looking their best and being able to partition those nutrients, all the food that they need, it's a shot in the dark, really. So I like front loading better than I like back loading. It's just safer. but I'm not saying you can't backload because you most definitely can.
I agree with that it's definitely safer. It's definitely a lot easier to at least monitor. So for your front loads, what would the carbs be like, or the carbs and fats be like in the beginning of the week as opposed to like the end of the week? Does it drop significantly or maybe not?
I'd say like the start of peak week, their food's probably going to be at their lowest point. I don't try to deplete, but naturally as they're that lean, and they're in shape, in stage shape where they need to be, they are going to be depleted no matter what. So their calories are going to be at their lowest point. What that looks like for that person, for like, I'll use Francesca since she was the most recent, she was on 1493 average calories. So that's not that low. That was her lowest point in prep. And that was what she was on, I think, Sunday and Monday. And then basically, based on our previous refeeds that we have done, I found a caloric value that I wanted to, or like an estimated carb amount that I thought we might utilize or need.
Mm-hmm.
And that equation is not always, or that calculation, that estimation is not always correct. Like, because obviously show day, she took in 530 carbs because I was trying to avoid her from going flat because she was moving food so quickly. She's a metabolic monster. So it really does vary. But I would say that, the first day, it's pretty moderate carbs based on previous refeeds. Next day, you make a decision based on where they wake up at, where their weight is, if they're still flat. Okay, do I hold? Do I bring carbs down? Do I bring them up? If you bring them up, okay, let's look at their PM weight compared to last night's or the previous night's weight. Let's see how much fuller they are. Next day, do the same thing over again. It's constant assessment, needs analysis.
If you guys do want to help fund the podcast as well, Code Nile will get you guys a discount off of Young LA and huge supplements. So what's with bodybuilders' obsessions with rice cakes and peanut butter and almond butter?
I don't know. I mean, most rice cakes are made out of brown rice, so I'm not a huge fan of them. Some just genuinely like the flavors. Like, I see people like my athletes using different flavors in different meals, and I'm like, I just eat rice. I'm so basic. I'm so basic when I eat, though. Even still.
Yeah, I mean, when you do a peak week, do you normally give your athletes just basic rice and?
So whatever foods we've been using the whole prep, I will stick with. I'm not one of those guys that lower fiber intake. I think a lot of coaches make that mistake because what ends up happening is if you change fiber intake, whether you mess with insoluble or soluble fiber ratios, you start changing gut motility. You change motility and someone doesn't have a bowel movement as frequent, and then you get backup of waste. You see it on stage. You see the distension.
Yeah, dude, for sure.
Yep. So I keep it as constant as possible with whatever foods we've been using. That includes fruits, that includes vegetables. Now, there are times where I need to move food quicker. So I'll be a little bit more apprehensive about using fiber or even protein, right, to continue to move food more quickly. But I don't ever pull out fruits. I know a lot of people fear fruits, but honestly, nutrient partitioning, carbohydrate partitioning, and nutrient uptake picks up significantly with fruit.
Nice. I'm a big fan of fruits. My biggest pet peeve are the coaches that are like, "Don't eat fruits; it's sugar." I'm just like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever fucking heard, man.
It's like when it comes down to breaking down to a molecular form, it's still glucose. Like it still breaks down to glucose. It doesn't change.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it all does essentially, right? It just depends on the GI. And dude, you like freaking an apple is significantly lower than even brown rice.
Yep. And you'll digest it way quicker.
Mm. Okay. So protein. I feel there's a lot of controversy in protein when it comes to like the bodybuilding industry, like if you're into fitness, you look at the research, like 1.2 if you're cutting whatever times your weight, whatever it's shit like that. But when it comes to bodybuilding, it's a little different, right? So what are your opinions on how much protein a bodybuilder should be eating in the off season and prep?
I mean, as much as they can handle. To be honest, like think about it. There are some people that have issues with higher amounts of protein. So digestion usually is the first indicator to something being, quote unquote, too much protein. Where does this fall? Well, I mean, we have studies by Dr. Jose Antonio that was doing significant amount. Like we're doing, what was he doing? 3 grams per kilogram. I forget what the actual ratio was he was doing. It's been so long since I read those studies, but he was the one doing, with the effects of high protein diets. One, in healthy individuals, they don't negatively impact healthy individuals whatsoever, or taxed kidneys. Again, keyword healthy individuals. Someone that has some type of renal issues, they may want to consider, not doing that, obviously, and being more cautious of intake. But I will work somebody up to an amount that they can tolerate very well. We don't notice any GI issues or disturbances. They don't have any acid reflux issues, so they have enough stomach acid to actually break down the protein effectively. I think that's my first consideration. And then there's also consideration of like, do people even like protein? And then the people that they don't enjoy eating protein, which there are some, it's how much do we need to efficiently build muscle and recover appropriately? So it can really range. I don't really have like this mark of like, hey, 1.5 grams, per pound or something like that, or 1 gram per pound. It really varies for my athletes.
I see. I feel like that would make sense that it varies. I have found something interesting though is as I continuously increased my calories and slowly started eating more protein as well, my body was able to slowly accept it better. And I can't really say if this is just because I've been focusing more on my gut health or what, but I know for sure that like when it was hard for me to eat say 230 grams of protein before. Now if I space it out properly, it's easy for me to eat 270 grams of protein throughout the day, which is just something I found interesting.
Yeah, you separate that the feeding times, like condensed feeding times, it does go down much easier. So like spacing it out, or like just spreading it in smaller portions, multiple portions throughout the day, more condensed feeding windows usually does help quite a bit of people. There's also like thermic effect of food. So protein has a high thermic effect, meaning a lot of times as you're, it costs a lot of calories just to digest protein in general. So there's a degree of calorie burn from thermic effect of food too. And
I'd
protein is
say
one of those.
that's actually a bigger proponent for why I noticed this change. Not so much on my timing because I was always eating protein. I was always timing protein like say 5 meals a day. Trying to space it out like say 3 hours in between or something, just as an example. But when I was eating significantly more calories, like there was a period of time where I was in such a deficit where eating protein, like say I started the morning with 50 grams of protein, I feel like I would knock out. Like I'd feel like I'd go to sleep because my body just didn't have enough energy in my freaking body in the morning to digest that properly.
Mhm.
Whereas these days now I can eat 40, 50 grams of protein and I can still like, I can focus pretty well on work. I still do notice like a little hit to my, cognitive function, but it's not too bad.
Oh, just because of the food intake kind of slowing you down a little bit.
Yeah. Just the protein
Yeah.
consumption, digesting the protein. Like I find like if I ate like if I just ate carbs and fats in a meal or something, I wouldn't really feel that cognitive change as much as when I have that much protein. But I mean, it's protein.
Yeah, it takes longer to digest, that's for sure.
So when would you say that someone is ready for a refeed, or can you explain your reason for a refeed?
Yeah, I think naturally, refeeds are going to be, I think, more powerful or more effective the leaner somebody is, or the longer somebody's been in a deficit. Now, there's obviously guidelines to that. If you go too long, you have somebody in deficit for like a year, refeed's not going to help them at that point because what we're looking for from a refeed is metabolic activity, right? A metabolic increase. So with refeed specifically, this is 2 days or more of a specific macronutrient at a higher rate. And it could increase or titrate up per refeed day. It could stay the same. A lot of times my objective in these is yes, to get a metabolic increase, feed them more food, get some degree of muscular fullness back. But also I'm probably going to pull cardio during this time because I'm going to actually try to lower fatigue levels and I want to see inflammation decrease. So I should see the physique looking better. Right. So if someone has stalled in a diet, meaning we're not seeing anything happen, if I pull food or add cardio, nothing happens, it's probably time for a refeed and a cardio break. And I'll just kind of couple those two together because they usually should go hand in hand in most cases.
Gotcha. So
If someone's inflamed, maybe they're not recovering enough, I may go ahead and have them do a refeed, cardio break, training break. If I just want to, I don't really do mock peaks, but if I want to see how someone responds to a higher caloric amount to get an idea for their peaking and how to structure their peak, then I'll go ahead and do a refeed as well.
Okay. What's the difference between a refeed and a diet break?
Sure. Diet break's going to be probably a week or more on a given caloric value or a macronutrient value. During, again, I think the reasons to do them are the same. But our objective should be to get somebody out of a refeed scenario as quickly as possible and back into the deficit, especially if we have a timeline, so like a show, like in a national show, right? Whereas if someone's just dieting for leisure or lifestyle, they want, a vacation, we have an ample amount of time to do this. I may give them a diet break 7 days or more sometimes. And in that 7 days of that diet break time frame, you may notice you add calories in and they start getting leaner and leaner and leaner, right? And they look better and their weight's going down. And a lot of times you can get this response because metabolic activity is picking up or decreasing inflammation. So therefore, we're getting multiple hormonal systems to work better. So that's kind of the difference. Refeed's just shorter period of time, has more intent, whereas a diet break is going to be longer.
Okay. Just a quick thing. I actually really liked in one of your podcasts, you mentioned that a lot of people are scared of insulin, and I was actually one of those people. I was one of the guys who was just like, oh gosh, insulin, I could die, and I don't know, it sounds like it's a big drug or something, some shit like that. But you're mentioning that, if you do use insulin properly, you can help, your increase in insulin resistance, especially if you're using something like GH. So I always found that really interesting. Could you expound on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, GH, its main mechanism is to release energy substrates for recovery purposes. And I want to put a little asterisk next to that. It does not mean GH builds muscle. Its main purpose is to just release energy substrates for recovery purposes. That include connective tissue, bone remodeling, right? Muscular tissue, yes, recovery, right? Organ systems. But with that, when you're releasing energy substrates into the bloodstream, blood glucose levels are already naturally increasing, which is why people experience insulin resistance when utilizing higher amounts of GH. That higher amounts of GH is interpretable for the person. Some people, 4 IUs, they experience insulin resistance. 8 IUs, and they don't experience until 8 IUs. There's other people like that too. Now, insulin is actually relatively easy to use. All we're doing is, again, I think people get confused and they misconstrue what happens when you take insulin. People think when you take insulin, the pancreas stops producing insulin. It's not the case. It continues to produce X amount of insulin, or we'll just say X amount of IUs of insulin daily for you. Unlike androgens, you supplement testosterone, your body or your testes stop producing testosterone. Insulin, not related to that whatsoever. So your body, your pancreas is still producing insulin. All we're doing is adding more insulin because we're adding more food. If we didn't add insulin and we just continue to add food, there is going to be insulin resistance present, right? So beta cell functionality in the pancreas starts to drop. And then that insulin resistance equation, like HbA1c, right? You look at fasting insulin levels or blood glucose levels. Those are 3 insulin sensitivity markers. Those are going to be skewed. And we're going to see some degree of insulin resistance potentiate through that process of upfeeding. Whereas if we just take the load off our pancreas and we say, okay, I'm going to throw out random numbers here. Our pancreas is producing 150 IUs of insulin a day. However, our food intake requires 200 IUs of insulin a day. So we are in a deficit of 50 IUs of insulin. Therefore, if we add 50 IUs, just throwing out a number again, don't add 50 IUs. If you add 50 IUs, you are now meeting the demands to move glycogen to where it needs to go to maintain insulin sensitivity and partition nutrients effectively. So it's literally just doing, and in bodybuilding, I think we overcomplicate it. In diabetics, they use like a slide. Nurses use like a slide, or they test their blood glucose to determine how much insulin they need to apply. We're kind of doing the same thing in a way. We're just adding what is needed to keep that person healthy and keep partitioning nutrients effectively.
Okay, gotcha. So glucose disposal agents like, berberine and metformin, you believe that they don't stunt muscle hypertrophy?
Oh, you're talking about the mTOR pathway? So metformin's not a GDA. It's actually just controls hepatic dumping of glucose. So your liver dumps glucose every morning when you wake up, right? The body's like, yo, I got to get moving. What do I need? I need energy. I need glucose. So it dumps glucose. Metformin controls and regulates that dumping and also regulates how fat cells or how many fat cells are produced. So it does downregulate that production of fat cells a little bit. It doesn't shut down, especially in bodybuilding community who's using anabolics. It is not affecting the same subunits of muscle growth. So it is completely a different set of subunits that are impacted, those mTOR activation. It's completely different. GDAs, on the other hand, like berberine or cinnamon, banana leaf extract. Gosh, there's a number of them. All of those kind of work on insulin sensitivity or partitioning nutrients in different modalities. Like berberine itself just clears glucose out of the bloodstream. They're all very effective. They're not going to blunt muscle growth whatsoever. In fact, if you improve insulin sensitivity, people will grow quicker, way faster. Natural or enhanced. That's still a very true statement.
Okay. I thought berberine also does that with mTOR.
I think you're right, actually. I think that same piece of literature came out about metformin and berberine, but it's not the same subunits of muscle growth.
Okay, cool. I feel like anecdotally that would make sense, since from anecdotal evidence in the forums and shit like that, no one has ever seen any actual blunting of muscle production. If anything, they've only seen like a benefit in body composition.
Yeah, and that's where I think literature like has its disadvantages, because we're also looking at people like Gen Pop. You look at resistance trained individuals in Gen population, like they're not training like bodybuilders. They don't eat like bodybuilders. They don't sleep like bodybuilders. They don't use the drugs bodybuilders do. So it's kind of like a lot of data is null and void when it comes to the bodybuilding population, because we're anomalies. We're different.
Mm-hmm. I agree with this. Someone is asking, how do you keep your kidneys healthy? What are things to take and do? Asked by Samuel.
That's a great question. So kidney health is imperative. And for the reasons of, you tax your kidneys to the point where they start decreasing in overall function. And one of the markers on blood work you should be looking at is EGFR, which is your kidney filtration rate. If that drops, it's very hard to get that back. And if it drops under a certain amount, you're going into kidney failure. Right? Renal failure. So what do we want to do? One, make sure you're checking your blood pressure consistently. Any sign of hypertension, we need to be taking care of it immediately. And the modalities on how to take care of that, it differs. There are certain supplements you could take to lower blood pressure. I know like Revive has their blood pressure, supplement. There's garlic extract, which helps with blood pressure. Or you could go into like the telmisartan or the sartan class drugs, which are renal protective, and they do promote cardiovascular tissue remodeling as well. So, again, I'm not saying go use telmisartan, but if it is warranted, then go ahead and take that on. But really, it's protecting kidneys really comes down to monitoring blood pressure, especially for enhanced males. That's crucial because it's a silent killer. That's the one thing that if I could advise any enhanced male to do, or male in general, is watch that. There's a few supplements out there that you could take. Kidney, it's actually a supplement coming out by Morphogen. It's called Kidney. They had Nephrogen was their former product, which was great. It's helped me recover a lot of kidney function in a lot of individuals. Kidney by Revive is another good one. So those are all supplements you can do. The main ingredient here is astragalus, which that definitely helps with kidney or renal function in general. But I think if you maintain really good blood pressure in your career and watch using diuretics, obviously, you should be pretty safe and sound.
It's my big issue, at least when I was trying to stay shredded for Instagram. I definitely took a hit to my kidneys for stupid reasons. Yeah,
it happens. But, I've noticed that a lot of people can improve functionality. It just takes a long time. And some people don't fully get it back to where it needs to be, but it can improve.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are the biggest mistakes that young competitors make?
Oh, boy. Competing too soon. That's a big one, especially if competitors want to be truly successful. The one thing that I always like to point out, like on my roster, is majority of my first-time athletes, majority of them, win their class or win the overall more times than not. And there's a reason. It's because I do have all of my first-time athletes truly take a dedicated offseason to learn how to be a bodybuilder, how to pose, how to eat like a bodybuilder, how to train like a bodybuilder. So I would say invest a ton of time in education and learning how to be a bodybuilder before you step on stage. Also have incredible guidance. Like have a coach that educates you, is willing to take the time to educate you, and teach you not only how to eat better or what supplements to take, but how to train better. And I review all of my athletes' training on a continuous basis. They send me videos. I look at them, critique, adjust based on biomechanics, whatever they need, adjust their programming. If you have someone that takes the time to do that, man, it's an invaluable tool because you will shed off years of learning experience that you would have wasted trying to troubleshoot on your own. So I think that's the major thing that athletes need to do is just don't rush to compete. Take the time you need to improve because it's much more satisfying feeling stepping on stage and winning than getting your face stepped on. Trust me.
I agree this. I agree.
Yeah, like that's important. Other than also, taking your health supplements, whether you're natural or enhanced, taking health supplements and getting regular blood work is something that's crucial and will add to your longevity and how much progression you could potentially get. And I think those are my top two.
Nice. I was actually I was natural when I started competing, and I think I wish that I knew this prior, but I didn't, and so I competed in 9 different shows because I did really well for my regionals as natural, but then when I was going to nationals as natural, I was getting 16th plus place, right? Not even placing, and it was freaking miserable, bro. Like I think I just got lucky that I ended up winning my pro card on. It's a complicated story. I talk about it in every podcast, but I didn't know what I was doing. Took orders from a coach, and then I ended up winning my pro card on halotestin and winstrol. But I had never injected like testosterone at that point. Obviously, didn't know what I was doing. So afterwards, what happened? Testosterone crashed, depressed, fucking hormonal issues, just the worst. Yeah,
right.
But
and all those things were avoidable. And you could have been continuously progressing that whole time instead of having to take a pit stop and do these health phases and stuff,
I agree. That's why I do believe, getting a coach, getting a mentor, no matter what you're doing is always going to be helpful, but especially in bodybuilding, getting a mentor that will care about your health, care about your blood work.
Yep.
Then you're going to go miles because then you won't have to go like the 2 extra years that I had to do experimenting on myself, just researching myself instead of having someone just be like, no, just get your blood work done. And this is how you do it. This is how you stay healthy.
It's funny. A lot of my coaching is spent saying no to people because we get so excited, right? We're so excitable, especially in the bodybuilding industry. We want to be on stage. We'd like the external validation. We want to go win, but we all want to now. And a lot of times it's me teaching people that I'm like, no, that can't happen right now. If we try to do that now, there's consequences, right? And so it's a mixture of saying no, but also preparing them on how to get to where they want to be. It's a funky dynamic sometimes.
Mm-hmm. And then I think you have to like leave here soon, right?
Yeah, soon. Yep.
Okay, cool.
I probably got another about 20, 25 minutes.
All right, bet. We'll just ask a couple of these people's questions and wrap it up.
Okay.
Cool. Someone Subhasish asks, can IGF-1 DES be used till contest day?
And here's the big thing. Is it real IGF-1 DES? You know what I mean? We're talking about something that I would just like, why do we need it in? Are there better things? This is where I just truly like sticking to the basics, your basic anabolics, because there's far more research and anecdote on those and truly knowing if those are real. And I think just a lot of like IGF-1 DES is just not real, or it's a fraction of the dosing that it claims to be. So like, can you? Yeah, I mean, you could do anything. Is it really that useful? No. There's a lot of other things that you could be doing and investing in and focusing on that would significantly impact and improve your physique.
Gotcha. How should PEDs differ in the off season versus on prep?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think we get caught up in the discussion of like, these drugs are bulking drugs. These are cutting drugs. And I don't think that truly exists. Anabolics, all build muscle tissue, and it's just that they are muscle builders. Now, how should they differ? I think I like to stay away from orals in the off season, because why tax liver and kidneys in a season where we want to try to be healthiest? So in contest prep, I'm going to use obviously more DHT derivatives or higher dosages of DHT derivatives, like your anavar, your winstrols, right? Your primo and your masteron, right? Those are your DHT derivatives. I'm not saying don't use those in an off season because they're great drugs. They still build muscle tissue. They're non-aromatizing compounds. So if you get someone that aromatizes at a higher clip and you want to increase androgen load, throw Masteron on. It doesn't aromatize, so you won't have estrogenic issues. And there's a proponent to estrogenic control. So really it's just cycle design's tough because it's really person dependent. Obviously I'm not going to use probably like NPP or, a decanate, in a contest prep. That's a big question. That's hard to break down. It's just cycle design. And I need to probably clarify this. Cycle design is something that needs to be done on an individual basis, more so than anything else, because yes, testosterone is our base, we quote unquote base, but ultimately you start adding on other compounds, you're looking for physical characteristics and attributes from those specific drugs or that class of drugs. So when we start building this design, yes, we want the effects from this drug because this drug gives us these cosmetic effects, but that person or that individual may not respond well to that drug. Again, whether they're dealing with aromatization issues or we're dealing with DHN conversion. So when you design this cycle, there's a neurological component, some of these drugs too, that negatively impact people. And then they're more prone to like depression. So, I just say, again, it comes down to having a really good educated coach on these things, because when you build these cycles and the design of these cycles, it needs to fit that individual.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's a really complicated question to answer, or it would be a whole podcast topic.
Yeah, I do agree. I do.
Yeah.
There's a lot
I'd
of
say contest prep, you're going to go more the DHT derivative route and heavier on the androgenic load in that capacity. Whereas off season, you have more options. I would just say don't use orals because you are going to tax liver and kidneys that you don't need to do.
Right. I tend to see more often than not that in the off season too. Yeah, like you said, androgen load is lower than on prep.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Well, I think some of these questions are really interesting. I guess I might as well. Does busting too many nuts hinder performance?
Depends, man. Like, does your mood drop? It's like, sometimes you get tired, man. Bust too many nuts, fucking tired. I get it.
All right, whatever. Anyways, bro, thanks for coming on this podcast, dude. This was phenomenal, man.
You're welcome, man. I hope people have some good takeaways. I know some questions, there's so much complexity and layers to them, and it's hard to give like individual, you can't give individual advice and specifics, which is really hard. And so all I can do is use examples from my athletes and give you just a basic direction,
Right.
But when you get into actual like coaching and stuff, that's when you get into the specifics that need to be covered on an individual basis. But I appreciate you having me on, man. It was a good time talking.
Yeah,
a lot
dude.
of fun.
You're a wealth of knowledge, bro. That was sick. That was hella sick.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure
Happy to
everyone's
hop on
really going to
anytime.
appreciate that a lot. So where can people find you?
Sure. So on Instagram, they can find me at the Megatron _. I'm there. Pretty easy to access. I try to answer all my DMs, try to get to all those. At Tomanek Trained is our coaching page, and tomanektrained.com is our website. I can be accessed on any of those.
Hell yeah. Awesome. Thanks, bro. Thank you so much. Then
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
If you guys want to support the podcast, you can support a non-cost way by rating us a 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and subscribing to the YouTube channel. Again, and if you guys are having symptoms of low T, or you do want to get your blood work done, which I do recommend getting it done with a wellness specialist, you can do it at any HRT clinic. My HRT clinic is Transcend. That link will be below. Do you happen to have an HRT clinic or anything that people can go to?
Not yet. It's in the process, but Transcend is good. Rise HRT is really good too.
Okay, nice. Hell yeah. All right, that's about it. So hope you guys enjoyed the podcast, and please check out Mark's shit. He's a genius, and his podcast has so much information for you guys to learn from. So thanks again, bro.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
Peace.